Silence, no calls, no texts, no late-night emotional ambush. When both you and the narcissist stop contacting each other, it doesn't create peace the way you might expect. It creates something far more disturbing for them, because when the narcissist realizes the connection has truly gone quiet, their mind doesn't move on. It starts running a psychological calculation that most people never see. Before we go deeper, take a moment to reflect on this. Have you ever experienced a situation where complete silence from someone changed the entire dynamic? If so, stay with this discussion, because the psychological mechanics behind that silence reveal something most people never notice. When contact between you and a narcissist completely stops, the silence does not feel neutral to them. For most people, silence can slowly create emotional distance and eventually closure. But for a narcissist, the absence of interaction creates what psychologists often describe as a psychological vacuum. Their sense of identity and emotional stability is strongly tied to feedback from others. Attention, reactions, admiration, or even conflict all provide them with a kind of psychological fuel. When that flow suddenly disappears, the space it leaves behind becomes deeply uncomfortable. Instead of experiencing calm, the narcissist often experiences a subtle form of inner agitation. The mind begins scanning for explanations. Why did the interaction stop? Are they being ignored? Has the other person moved on? Are they losing influence? These questions are not necessarily driven by genuine emotional attachment, but by the disruption of their expected control over the relationship dynamic. Silence removes the mirror they normally use to maintain their self-image. Without someone responding to them, reacting to them, or orbiting around their behavior, they lose an important source of validation. This creates tension because their internal sense of self is less stable than it appears from the outside. What looks like confidence often relies heavily on external reinforcement. As a result, the quiet space left by no contact can feel psychologically loud to them. Their mind may replay past conversations, analyze the last interaction, or imagine different scenarios that explain the sudden absence of engagement. In many cases, the silence becomes more mentally consuming for the narcissist than ongoing conflict ever was. When the silence continues and there is still no contact between you and the narcissist, their mind begins searching intensely for an explanation. Most people, when faced with distance from someone, eventually accept that the relationship has ended or changed. A narcissist rarely processes it that way. Their ego is structured around the belief that they remain significant in the lives of others. So when someone disappears without explanation or stops reacting entirely, it challenges that internal belief system. Instead of accepting the simple possibility that you chose to walk away, the narcissist's mind starts building alternative interpretations. They may assume you are trying to provoke them, playing a game, or waiting for them to make the first move. In their thinking, silence often has to mean something strategic because they are used to relationships revolving around power and reaction. The idea that someone could simply stop caring is psychologically difficult for them to accept. To protect their self-image, the narcissist often reframes the situation in ways that keep their ego intact. They might convince themselves that you are too emotional, too weak, or too intimidated to contact them. Sometimes they believe you are secretly thinking about them constantly, but are afraid to reach out. These explanations allow them to maintain a sense of superiority while avoiding the uncomfortable possibility that they no longer hold influence. This mental reconstruction can continue for a long time because the silence leaves the situation unresolved. Without new information or interaction, the narcissist fills the gap with assumptions that defend their self-perception. In many cases, the explanation they create says more about protecting their ego than about understanding what actually happened. When communication completely stops, something else disappears with it that the narcissist depends on more than most people realize: the ability to influence the emotional environment. During the relationship, even conflict gave them a form of control. They could provoke a reaction, trigger a discussion, create drama, or draw attention back to themselves. Every response from you confirmed that they still had psychological access to your thoughts and emotions. Silence removes that access. Suddenly, they cannot predict what you are feeling, what you are thinking, or whether you are even thinking about them at all. For someone whose sense of power often comes from shaping other people's reactions, that loss of control can create a quiet but persistent anxiety. The relationship may be over, but the absence of influence leaves an unfinished psychological loop. This anxiety does not always appear as sadness or heartbreak. More often, it shows up as restlessness or irritation. The narcissist may feel an urge urge to reestablish some form of connection, not necessarily to repair the relationship, but simply to confirm that their presence still matters. Even a small response would restore a sense of influence. Without that feedback, they are forced into a position they dislike: uncertainty. They cannot test their impact, they cannot provoke a reaction, and they cannot measure their importance in your emotional world. For individuals who rely heavily on external responses to regulate their sense of significance, this lack of control feels deeply uncomfortable. Over time, this discomfort can push them toward indirect attempts to regain influence because silence removes the stage where they normally perform their sense of dominance. When the silence continues and the narcissist still receives no response, the next psychological move often happens quietly inside their mind. They begin rewriting the story of the relationship. This is not usually a conscious decision to lie to themselves. It is more like an automatic defense mechanism that protects their self-image from feeling damaged or rejected. In a healthy breakup, people eventually reflect on both sides of the relationship. They might admit mistakes, recognize incompatibilities, or accept that the connection simply ran its course. A narcissist's mind rarely processes the ending in such balanced terms. Their internal narrative must keep their sense of superiority intact, so the story gradually shifts in a direction that favors them. They may start remembering the relationship in exaggerated ways that make them appear more patient, more generous, or more desirable than they actually were. At the same time, your role in the story may slowly change. In their retelling, you might become overly emotional, unstable, ungrateful, or incapable of appreciating them. This mental revision allows them to conclude that the relationship ended because of your shortcomings rather than their behavior. Over time, the rewritten narrative can feel completely real to them. Memory is flexible, and when someone repeatedly tells themselves a certain version of events, it starts to feel like the truth. The silence between you makes this easier because there is no new interaction to challenge the story they are building. In this way, the absence of contact becomes the perfect environment for the narcissist to reshape the past in a way that protects their ego. As the silence continues, something subtle begins to happen inside the narcissist's mind. What started as curiosity slowly turns into a kind of psychological fixation. Human beings are naturally uncomfortable with unresolved situations, but for a narcissist, this discomfort can be even stronger because they are used to being the center of attention and influence. When someone suddenly removes themselves from that dynamic, the mind keeps circling back to the unanswered question: what happened to the control they once had? At first, the narcissist may simply wonder why you stopped contacting them. But as time passes and no new information appears, that curiosity can intensify. The mind begins replaying past interactions, looking for clues. They might revisit old conversations, remember the last argument, or analyze the final message that was exchanged. The silence leaves the story unfinished, and unfinished stories tend to linger in the mind. This creates a psychological loop. The less information they receive from you, the more their imagination fills in the gaps. They may wonder if you are happier without them, if you have replaced them, or if you are intentionally ignoring them to prove a point. Even if they outwardly act indifferent, internally the uncertainty can keep pulling their attention back to the situation. Ironically, the very absence of contact can give the narcissist something they dislike most, a mystery they cannot easily solve. And when someone is used to controlling the narrative of a relationship, an unsolved mystery can become surprisingly difficult to ignore. As time passes and the silence continues, many narcissists begin looking for ways to regain information about you without directly breaking the no contact barrier. Even though they may appear indifferent on the surface, the lack of knowledge about your life can create a quiet tension. They are used to knowing where they stand in someone's world, and when that awareness disappears, curiosity often pushes them toward indirect observation. This monitoring does not always look obvious. Sometimes it happens through social media, where they quietly check your posts, your activity, or changes in your life. Other times it happens through mutual friends, acquaintances, or casual conversations where they ask small questions that seem harmless on the surface. The goal is not always to reconnect. Often the goal is simply to gather information. For a narcissist, information restores a small sense of control. If they know what you are doing, who you are spending time with, or how you appear emotionally, they can place themselves back into the mental narrative of your life, even if they are no longer interacting with you. Knowing something about you helps them reduce the uncertainty that silence created. What makes this behavior surprising is that it often happens quietly. The narcissist may act publicly as if they have completely moved on, showing confidence or indifference to others, but behind that appearance, they may still be watching from a distance, trying to confirm whether you are thriving, struggling, or thinking about them. In many cases, the silence does not erase their curiosity. Instead, it pushes that curiosity into the background where observation replaces direct contact. When the silence between you and the narcissist continues, another shift often begins to take place. Because their usual source of validation is no longer available, the narcissist may start accelerating their search for attention somewhere else. This is not always about forming a deep new connection. More often, it is about restoring the feeling of importance that came from being admired, noticed, or emotionally engaged with someone. During the relationship, your reactions, whether positive or negative, helped feed their sense of significance. When that source disappears, they may experience a subtle drop in confidence or stimulation. Instead of sitting with that discomfort, many narcissists quickly look for new people who can provide admiration, interest, or emotional energy. This can appear in different ways. They may suddenly become more active socially, reconnect with old contacts, or show unusual interest in meeting new people. Sometimes they present a very polished version of themselves, emphasizing charm, confidence, and success in order to attract attention quickly. The goal is to rebuild the environment where they feel valued and admired. To outside observers, it can look like they moved on effortlessly. In reality, the speed often reflects a need to refill the emotional space left by the loss of attention. The new interactions help them avoid focusing too long on the silence that developed with you. What makes this dynamic surprising is that while they may be investing energy into new admiration, the unresolved silence from the previous relationship can still exist quietly in the background of their thoughts. As the silence stretches on and neither of you reaches out, something unexpected begins to happen. What once looked like distance slowly turns into a quiet shift of psychological power. During the relationship, the narcissist likely depended on your reactions, your attention, your explanations, your emotional responses. Whether those reactions were positive or negative, they kept the connection alive and confirmed that they still occupied space in your mind. But when you remain silent, that familiar pattern breaks. The narcissist can no longer provoke you, charm you, argue with you, or draw you back into the cycle of emotional engagement. Without realizing it at first, you have removed the stage on which their influence used to operate. This absence of reaction is something many narcissists find difficult to navigate because their usual strategies rely on interaction. Your silence also sends an unspoken message. Your emotional world no longer revolves around them. Even if they never admit it openly, this realization can disrupt the internal narrative they prefer to believe, that they always remain important, memorable, or impossible to ignore. Over time, the lack of response becomes its own form of communication. It suggests boundaries, independence, and a life that continues without their involvement. For someone accustomed to controlling the emotional rhythm of a relationship, that kind of independence can feel deeply unsettling. What makes this moment powerful is that it requires no confrontation, no argument, and no dramatic closure. The silence itself becomes the signal that the dynamic has changed, and that change often carries more psychological weight than words ever could. So when both you and the narcissist stop contacting each other, the silence is never just silence. On the surface, it may look calm, even ordinary. Two people simply go their separate ways. But beneath that quiet space, an entire psychological process begins unfolding. For the narcissist, the absence of attention creates questions they cannot easily answer. The ego searches for explanations, the mind replays old moments, and the need for control quietly struggles against the reality that the connection is no longer responding. Some will watch from a distance. Some will rush toward new sources of admiration. Some will convince themselves the relationship never mattered. But the one thing that remains constant is the disruption created by your absence. And here is the part most people find surprising. The moment you stop feeding the emotional system that once revolved around them, the dynamic changes completely. What once felt like their power over you begins to dissolve, not because of a dramatic confrontation, not because of revenge, but because attention has been withdrawn. Silence becomes the boundary, distance becomes the message. The narcissist may try to reinterpret the story, search for new validation, or act as if they have moved on effortlessly. But the psychological space you created remains real. And that space gives you something many people struggle to reclaim after these relationships: clarity, independence, and the freedom to live a life that no longer revolves around someone who needed your attention more than your presence.